Welcome back to Allison Customs ProjectCarTV. We're back in the shop working on yet a different project. This is, I believe he told me it was a 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee. And what we're doing is a 2.5-inch lift kit on it, which is really just some spacers above the struts and a few extensions to make all the rest of the suspension line back up. So it should be a pretty quick and easy job. The owner bought the lift kit, was going to install it himself, ran into some issues with time, and he's kind of working out in the driveway, and it's the middle of winter right now. So it basically, he just got discouraged when he started playing with it. So we've got the instructions from Rough Country. I'm going to pull all 4 tires and wheels. We're just going to try and knock this out. Now, I've got it on the lift just to make it a little easier for me, and so I can do a little better filming for it. We're going to try and get you a pretty good view of what we're doing and how we're getting it done. I think this is about a 4 or 5 hour job. We'll know here shortly. So stay tuned, we'll get on it. So I've opened up all the boxes, which are actually pretty small. There's not a whole lot to this kit. For the front, we have 2 of these items, which are the spacer that go on top of the strut. So that just, you take the strut out, bolt this to the top, bolt the strut back in. Before you can do that, you do have to take the strut apart and put these preload spacers underneath the coil spring that's in the strut. So we'll have to dismantle the strut. Then on the rear, we have 2 coil spring spacers, and they're just around, I mean, it's a pretty simple piece of steel with a couple holes drilled in it. And then we have 4 of these for the rear that are for the shock spacers, and you can see the shape of that. And I think I'm going to go ahead and start on the rear just so I can knock that part out, because I think I can do that in about an hour or less. And then we'll come to the front, drop the struts out, and see if I can compress it here or if I'm going to need to run it into a shop. Alright, so we got the rear tire off. We're on the driver's side rear. Look through the instructions, it's pretty damn simple. It tells you exactly what tools you're going to need. The biggest one's a 24mm wrench, a 21mm wrench, which I didn't have, so 13/16 should get you close. 18mm wrench, 8mm, and a 10mm wrench, and they recommend a 10mm socket. So I've got that. So you're going to need a socket wrench, those regular wrenches, and then you need 18mm socket as well. I've got one on my impact. And what we've got to do is remove the bolts from the 2 upper control arms. We need to remove the sway bar link, and we need to remove, there's a tie rod back here to adjust the toe in on the rear suspension. So we're going to drop the shock. We're going to put 2 of these brackets on top of the shock, and then we do need to mark the orientation of the coil spring so that it goes back in correctly. Not, you know, just I'll use a paint pen and just mark it so that you have something you can line it up with to put it back in. And there's an isolator up here. The coil spring is loaded with pressure, even though everything's stretched out here, so you do need a jack underneath this portion of the truck. So I've got some high lift jacks. I'm gonna probably raise this up just a hair more. Put 1 jack under the front end to stabilize this. I mean, the truck itself is very stable, but to stabilize the process, because once I put a jack under here, I need to be able to lower everything down, and we don't want everything getting wobbly as we're taking pressure off this spring. So I'm going to get a couple more tools out, get the jacks lined up. In the directions, the first item we're going to remove is the tie rod end. So we're going to do the tie rod, and then we're going to do the lower shock mount. And I've got this jack under here to support, basically to compress the shock just a little bit. And that's the reason I had to put a jack stand at the front of the truck, so that I'm not basically picking this up off the lift. If you're doing this in your driveway, leave the front tires on the ground and do the back end and then do the front end. You just need a floor jack here. You could compress it as much because you basically be lifting the truck by the A-arm. It's going to put a little bit of compression on the spring. And you'd have some jack stands back here about where my lift is at, so that as you start lowering the truck down, the body stops moving, and then the spring can open up and relieve all the pressure off of it. And then we've got to there's a wire for the brake speed sensor. So we need to take that loose, and we need to take the sway bar loose. So That's what I'm going to get at. Basically 18 millimeter wrenches, 21 millimeter, 24 millimeter. We should knock this out pretty quick. It does tell you to save all the hardware. So don't lose any of your hardware. You probably need it to put everything back together. Upper control arm. There's one that's stamped steel. That one's 18 millimeter. The bolt comes pretty much right out. So that's that one. The other one, which is on the back side over here of the rotor, can't get the socket where the nut is, so you're gonna have to use the wrench on that side. But with a long extension, I believe we can get all the way in, so we don't have to try and do 2 wrenches. I'll just pull these 2 plastic inserts so that we can get up in here to get to the nuts and bolts. So let me get a little pry tool here, and we'll pull down these 2 and drop this shock out of the way. One more tool you need, which is a 16 millimeter socket to get up in here to the top shock mounts. Again, the long extension helps there. That's not working either. So what the problem is the stud in the joint is spinning. Okay, so what I had to do, this shock out, kind of you see, the end of these sway bar links has an 8 millimeter socket head on it or whatever, so you could put a wrench on there. I locked a socket on there, and then you're able to get your 18 millimeter wrench on there and basically take the nut off. So 2 wrenches or whatever there, that's why you needed the 8 millimeter, but we've got that off now. And just watch, make sure you're not pulling anything too loose or out of the way. Now we don't really need to take the shock all the way out, because we're just going to lay 2 of those plates on top and push it right back in. And then we'll pull down on everything a little bit and get this spring out in just a minute. But so you take 2 of these, sandwich them together, and it just lays on top and goes right back in where it came from. And the kit comes with some new bolts for this, so that's what's in the bag. Instead of using the stock hardware, we're going to use some out of the bag here. So I've been using 1/2-inch sockets, 1/2-inch drive sockets, and to put these back in, the sockets are also deep well. So to put this back in, I don't want a deep well. And of course, the new bolts are now 18 millimeters, so I got to get a different shallow socket. So these bolts, it says, are a 10 millimeter by 40 millimeter long. So they're just longer than the originals. So that'll let us get this all the way back up in there. There's the second one. So I honestly think you could do this without pulling these plastic clips out of there. Might be a little easier, but they suggested taking both of them out. I only took out the one and still don't really even think that was necessary. So that's hung. We should be able to lower this a little more and then pull down and get the spring out of here. There it is. All this is what's in the pocket on this one, so need to clean all that out before we put the new pieces in. Get a little brush. Alright, so now it's time to put that preload spacer that we talked about on this cup. This goes in the bottom of the coil spring, like so. And then we can shove all this back in here. What you want to do is kind of line up the top as best you can, and then pull down on this thing, on the rotor and axle and all that as much as you can. Get that lined up. And then we're right about there, and then use your jack to start pushing it back up in place. Let's see, you know why we got this out? I'm going to take this sway bar link and go clean up the threads real quick. So I'll be right back. So that took about 30 seconds on the wire wheel over on the grinder. Now, get that back in place. As we get this rolled up into place for everything, that's basically in place. Shock, this needs to come up about another 1/4 inch for the shock to fit. I've got my wrench set down pretty low so we're not over torquing any of this. All right, we just got these other two to do. So now we can torque everything. The upper shock mounts, it says to torque to 32 foot-pounds. There. And the rest of them, it says, rest of them, the instructions say torque to the factory specs. So I'm gonna have to look those up real quick for all these different links. But so online, I found on the Jeep forum, I found somebody who posted the factory manual. The manual shows the lower bolt on the shock being 85 feet-pound. The top ones, the manual shows 70, although Rancho's suspension kit says 32 on each side. They're only a 10mm thread bolt, so 70 seems pretty steep there to me. And then on the upper links here, it shows, I believe it was 90 foot-pounds. And then on this link here, it shows 70. Sway bar links are like 30. That's about it. We have to put that one 10mm bolt back in with our sensor, but that's just basically hand tight. So that's that one. And then we can get these others, these 18mm ones. All right, those are all tight. Do our sensor wire again. And that just screws into the top of this bracket. And again, 10mm socket. Doesn't need to be real tight, it's just a plastic fitting there. Alright guys, that took me an hour and 20 minutes. I chased numerous tools, so the other side will go way quicker because all the tools are out. Ran the camera, I talked to you about what I was doing. So I think I could have done it in an hour without any interruptions. And I imagine the other side will be done in more like 45 minutes. So I'm going to go do the other side and I'll see you at the front. All right, well, I'm done with the rear and I'm actually already gone ahead and done the passenger side. It took me quite a little while. And the reason is it's the spring on the strut. I have a couple different kinds of spring compressors. Let me get them real quick. This style where it's a couple clamps and you put one on each side of the spring, you know, about 180 degrees off, and you try and clamp it. And then I have this big V-clamp style, and that one actually finally got the job done, but I had to reset it like 3 times. I squeezed everything, was able to take it apart, but I hadn't squeezed it enough, so you know there was some energy left in it. Be careful, it is dangerous, but you really need one that can compress the whole spring in a much more stable manner. So I need one that is like a freestanding, probably in the range of 6 ton. Well, maybe not 6 ton, maybe 4 ton, 3 ton. But anyway, I got it done, and we're on to the next part here, or to this side. The other side took me probably in the neighborhood of 4 hours. I don't think this side will take as long, because I have figured out how to go ahead and get a hold of the spring and do it. So I think I can do it all in one shot this time instead of 4, you know, literally I think I squeezed it, wasn't enough, reset my spring clamps, wasn't enough, changed to the other type of clamp, and it wasn't enough the first try, but the second try I got it. But you have to squeeze the springs almost completely touching each other. We're gonna get that done. The dismantling of it all goes pretty quick. So I'll go ahead and get some sockets out, and they have you kind of do it in some different orders. I'm gonna basically change it up a little bit. The first thing I'm gonna do is take the caliper off, get it completely out of the way, take the rotor off, get it out of the way while everything is still stable. Go ahead and take this axle nut off, because you do have to pull the axle out of the spindle or out of the upright. The upright comes off completely, so you're going to do an upper and lower ball joint removal. You got to take the sway bar loose, which is where the owner started doing it, and then apparently had problems because he's gotten me a new sway bar link already. So I think this one must be damaged. And then you got to take the steering arm off. So really you're going to take caliper, rotor, steering arm, sway bar, axle nut, and then upper and lower ball joints. And we'll put our jack underneath here just so we can lower it down a little bit. The other one, the strut really is extended pretty much as far as it will extend, so I didn't have really any energy stored up here, you know, maybe 1/4 of an inch of movement that I needed to take care of. So should go pretty quick as far as the dismantling of it, and then we'll attack this spring. They also recommend you take the bolts off the top of the strut tower. I would recommend you just leave those in place until you have everything else ready. And then you have to, the instructions recommend you remove the axle shaft. I found all I had to do was I put a tie down on my lower A arm here, and just a ratchet strap, and I just ratcheted it down out of the way. The axle would go with it, and it left me enough room to pull the strut out over it. So you'll see me do that. You could do the same thing in the driveway. You would just want to put your ratchet strap to your floor jack and pull down like into your floor jack, so you're or into the jack stand, something that the weight of the vehicle is actually supporting, so, or is holding down, if you will. Otherwise you'd have to have an anchor buried in the ground or something, which, you know, I don't have that here even. So anyway, I'm going to grab a couple more tools, and we're going to start dismantling this as quickly as we can. A couple zip ties to hold the caliper up out of the way, and it's really go pretty quick. You can do a lot of it with just an electric impact. Once again, so we're taking the caliper loose. I need to find my zip ties real quick. Found that it works pretty well just to zip tie it to the lower A arm, so I'm using 2 separate zip ties to accomplish that. So that is a 21mm socket to take off the caliper bolts, 10mm socket to take off the speed sensor again. Let's put it out of the way. I just usually been putting the bolts, most of the bolts back where I found them, just to kind of keep track of them all. And then to remove this, there's an O-ring that holds on, if assuming you still have your stock brakes, there's an O-ring right here that holds on this caliper. So just push, or that holds on the rotor. Just push the rotor in part way, get you a little pick or something, and you can get behind it. And I take a second pick. It's just a regular O-ring. It's reusable, so don't lose it. And you don't need anything special when you put it back in. You just push the rotor on far enough, and the O-ring will fall in and let you push right into the groove. A big chunk of this, we're going to take the steering arm off next, just to get it out of our way. That is also, that is a 21mm socket. And normally you have to hit the casting here on the steering, or on the upright, to get that to break loose. Again, I suspect this is about how far the owner got. put that up out of your way somewhere. You need an 18 millimeter for the sockets, or for the nuts on the sway bar links. And sometimes these will come off with just a socket. Well, that one did. But it was barely on there. Let's try this one. Yeah, we got it. We are ready to put the jack stand under here and take out the lower strut mount bolt. I believe it's a 24 millimeter, which works out to be 15/16 if you don't have one. The other side is a 21 millimeter. Let's get that. This upper bolt is a 21. Again, now the instructions will tell you not to take it all the way off. Take it off until it's hand tight. Otherwise, you're going to end up getting an Allen wrench and a wrench and holding the ball joint to get that out of there, because the inside of the upper ball joint stem has a place for an Allen wrench, and you hold that, you could hold it and then use a wrench to get it off. And what the goal is right there is that keeps the whole thing from springing apart, but we've got it loose enough that we can now take it off the rest of the way. And what you're doing is you're hitting the casting part here, and the idea is that it doesn't hit, you don't have to hit it very hard, but the idea is that it oblongs the hole for just an instant, and where the tapered ball joint is fit into that tapered hole, it changes the size just briefly and shocks it out of there. Now, whether that's what really happens, I don't know, but it tends to work. Put that nut back on there for now. So now we've got this laid out of our way, which is going to get us, we're going to knock the axle out part way, but then that's going to let us get a socket on the lower ball joint rather than having to do it with a wrench. Now, see, it's basically loose, and now the bolt's out, so you really almost don't need a jack. We probably don't need a jack under it, but you know, better have one handy just in case. So that's loose. This is loose. We're going to knock out the axle. There's a small hole essentially drilled into the end of this axle shaft, and you can try and put a punch in there. I've broken plenty of punches over the years doing it that way. Or you can take the ball end of a hammer, and I know a lot of people say you shouldn't hit one hammer on another hammer, but it works. You can see it moves. And I'm using the ball end, the ball peen end, to fit in that hole so we don't damage any threads. There we go. So once that axle can be basically taken out of your way, you can slide it out of the way. Now you can get a socket on there. And this goes back to that 24 millimeter again, or 15/16. Once again, they recommend you don't take that off all the way. Nothing's spring loaded. We got it off. There's a little spacer washer that goes on the end of this axle right here between it and the upright, so don't lose it. So now what we need is to pull this A-arm down out of our way. And like I said, I'm just going to use a ratchet strap. Well, welcome back, or I'm back, or something. I had to go to work, so I've been gone a couple days, so this has just been hanging on the lift for a few days. And I maneuvered this thing every way I could possibly think of. We're going to have to pull the axle shaft out. All you do is pop on it, and it'll pop right out of there. It's kind of held in with a little clip here that just puts a little bit of pressure on it. The one trick is have a bolt on the top of the strut holding it up out of your way. Then go up and take that last one off, and it'll come right out. so this was like this. We're going to pull all of this off right this second. We're going to try to. There we go. We're going to flip our strut 180 degrees. Put our bump stop back on. Got our preload spacer, which is 0.498 inches, so half an inch thick. We can set all of this back on here. The thing is, we need this apparatus out for this very second. Then our preload spacer goes on underneath this. There's a little nub on top of this rubber collar, and that just lines up with the nub or the hole. And the little slots line up with where the bolts go. And you put the whole thing back together. And once you got it all squeezed back together, again, the lines, we have this set to where it's going up. We got everything lined up here. Struts turned over. The spring has just a little more room between the coils, but by the time you put that spacer in and the spring's compressed up a little extra, it's just a little harder to get it off. Alright, so the extension, the part that makes it a lift or a leveling kit is this bracket here. I mean, that half-inch spacer certainly does some work by preloading the spring, but this is where the bulk of it comes from. And like I said, it reverses the bolt pattern. So you can see we have two in the back, one up front here. This goes on and reverses it, and that's the reason you're turning the strut around 180 degrees. It's interesting because when I first started playing with it and reading the instructions, they don't really tell you why you're turning the strut around 180 degrees. So I didn't grasp what the whole point was until I started putting the thing together, and then it dawned on me, oh, okay, we're turning it around so that this bolt pattern works with the wheel well still, or with the strut tower, whatever you want to call it up there. Alright, now when you're using a box in, you got to watch it. Don't go too tight, or you won't be able to get your wrench out. You got to be able to basically lift this thing up because your wrench is captured in there. But obviously a ratchet box end is faster than just doing it as an open end the whole way. Alright, with that on, we're going to take this back over, slip this into the truck first, get a nut up here on the top to hold it up out of the way, then we can shove the CV joint back in and start the reassembly, which is really just the reverse of everything we've done already, taking it apart. Should take about 30 to 45 minutes, so let's get after it. Alright, now before we slide this in here, two things we're going to do. We've already put some grease on the end of the splines here, and then there's a little retainer clip that's in there, and you want, it's basically just a C, and you want that to where when you go to put it in, the opening on the C is pointed down, and that's, so as you go in this at kind of the angle that we have to go in, to pop that back into the splines, and for that key to seat, it's just a little easier if that opening is pointed in the downward direction. And then the last thing that we're going to do here is we're going to put just a little bit of grease on the seal, just so we make sure as we're going in we don't accidentally tear anything up there. So just enough that everything kind of slides together really good, and then we can slide this in. Around that in there. once you shove that back in, and like I said, with the C-clip down, it is easier. It should go any direction, but because of all the angles we've got here, you're kind of trying to tilt it in there slightly. And as much of a pain in the butt as it was to get all this out, it's harder to put it back in because this opening right now is basically 2.5 inches lower than it was before. So as you can imagine, that causes, you know, clearance issues trying to get all this in there. So just get it in there and then give it a good shove. It'll pop in, and just make sure it seats all the way. And then you can kind of give it a little tug. You'll feel that clip is in its retainer ring. And so there's a little resistance right there, a little play and then a little bit of resistance, and that's just for everything to move. So we'll put the upright in and put this ball joint nut on and get it tightened so that we can use the impact on it, you know, as we're able to slide everything out of the way. And then we'll put our jack under here and start jacking it up. Now again, when you start jacking on this lower control arm to push the upright in place to get a hold of the upper control arm, and nothing really, you know, everything is tried to stretch out further apart, you're going to be lifting up on the truck. So if you're working off of a lift, put a jack stand under the back of the truck so that you're not tilting the truck off of the lift. But let's go ahead and get step one done. Let's get our ratchet out of the way. All right, let's get this thing. Don't forget to put your thrust washer on with the bottom ball joint just the threads just started. You can still flex this down enough that you can get that axle shaft in the hole and still have enough room to get to the nut with a socket. All right, so we've got the bottom ball joint tight. We've got our CV joint axle shaft into the splines on the hub. We need to get this upper A-arm pulled down enough to get into this and raise the lower control arm up enough that we get there. All right, guys, so at this point, I've now had the truck, that front driver's side strut and spindle assembly, all that stuff, apart 3, 4, 5 times. I have taken the spring off the strut, turned it, twisted it. What I can tell you is the strut spring ends up hitting the inside of the strut tower down at the bottom, like where the frame rail is at, long before you can get it all up in there and shoved in. And so I do finally find a solution, and this is the part that the title is referring to, in that something Rough Country doesn't tell you. Now, I do not know if this is the case on all of the kits, you know, or all of the trucks, meaning if it's a gas-powered truck, maybe the springs are a little shorter or a little longer or smaller diameter. I don't know. What I can tell you is on the diesel version of this Jeep, it is a nightmare to get the driver's side strut in. The passenger side went fast and easy. You don't have to take out the axle shaft, CV joints, all of that can just stay in the truck, in and out. It took me a couple hours to do that side, but it was the first one I'd ever done. The driver's side, complete nightmare. It is doable, but what you have to do is finally get the strut and the spring, well, the strut only goes in one way, but get the spring on that strut in such a way that you get a gap between where the bottom of the spring mounts and where the first coil comes around. And I'll show you that in the video, but just be aware, this is the trick that Rough Country's not showing you or telling you about, or they shouldn't be selling this for diesels if it's a diesel only thing. I don't know, but this is the part you're gonna really care about. Okay, so here's what I think I know. And I say think because I haven't tried it yet. However, when attempting to put this strut in earlier, I did it the way the instructions said. I went and reread the instructions 3 or 4 times, and I did it exactly the same way I did the passenger side, which went in smoothly. You do have to, you know, kind of use some muscle on the passenger side at least, just because you've got this extension on here, so everything's not quite where the factory designed it. On this one, what was happening when I would go to put the strut in, this side, this spring where the sticker side is, was hitting against the inner fender well up here on the, like on the frame rail, and would not let the strut tilt in far enough to line up the holes with the lower control arm. So I went back over, compressed the spring again, turned the spring 180 degrees to match the way it would have been on the strut originally. So you still have to have the top turned around, which means there's a little tit on the rubber bushing here that is supposed to go in a hole that now it doesn't line up right. I just ignored that and found a spot where everything lined up well enough that I could put it back together. So now we're going to try putting this back in. What that did was get me to where I have this little gap here before I get into that spring. Here they're almost parallel. Well, they're not parallel, but they're almost the same height for the bottom coil that retains the spring and this first part of the progressive coil. In the back here I gain about, I don't know, half, you know, basically a coil's width, so half an inch or so. And I'm hoping that will be enough to get it above this lip up here and let the strut go all the way in. So that's what we're going to try next. So I'm going to put the strut up in the hole, put the bolts on the top, and I'll just get a couple of them on, you know, somewhat loose so that I can move it around a little bit. And then I gotta, at the same time, I have to put the axle in so that we can then push that in, because I think what's going to happen is that axle is going to have to go in after the strut is basically in place, because again everything is moved down just a little bit and it's making the clearance up a little bit of an issue. If you've got another person that can help you, I would highly recommend it. That's basically going to sit there. This up in there. Alright guys, so what I finally ended up doing to make this all fit, so I put my jack, and if this was lower and you were doing this off a floor jack, would probably be easier, because what I ended up doing was putting a jack under one side of the strut here, jacking it up enough that the coil would clear the frame, and then I took a ratchet strap, wrapped it around here, and pulled the strut back, because I couldn't pry it. It didn't want to move on top of the jack pad. If you were on a floor jack, you could probably, because it's on wheels, you could probably move it once you got it up high enough. It's a pain in the butt. This is I don't know if it's because this truck is a diesel, and maybe that's why everything is not quite the way Rough Country would have designed it or something. But if they designed it like this is not the kit to buy. Anyway, we're going to now see if we can get the axle back in. So the answer is no. So we're going to have to jack up the lower control arm here. All right, that's in. Axle shaft started into the upright here. Just go ahead and get that ball joint tight while you still have access to it. Then put your axle nut on so none of this can fall off. And then we just got to get the upper A-arm into the lower. What I found last time was a ratchet strap could be your friend. You only need to go far enough to get that nut started. Again, this one's a 21 millimeter. Release our strap. All right, so we now have our upper our upper, our lower ball joint, our axle's in place. I have not tightened the strut bottom bolt or the strut top bolts. I have not tightened the nut on the axle here, but all those pieces are in place. So now we're going to run this back together, and it should go fairly quickly. So 32 millimeter on this. And we'll check the torque in a little bit. The inside one's 21 millimeter also. The 3 bolts on top of the strut are 13 millimeter. So I'll get the ladder, get up there. Actually, I'll probably just wait till I'm ready to drop the car down then, because I haven't torqued the top ones on the other side yet, and I'll just torque them all at once. Yeah, I just looked on the internet, found the torque settings for these different bolts. And so, as you may recall, the owner had damaged the sway bar end link during his attempt at this. And I'm not saying he couldn't have done it. What happened is, he's my neighbor, or was. He sold his house and he's moving 50, 60, 70 miles away. I don't know. I haven't been up to the new place. But he started the project, and then the house sold and closed like super fast. And all of a sudden he was like, I don't have time to finish it. So he had already damaged this part, and he was having trouble. He couldn't get these upper ball joints to come loose. Well, he was trying to do it with a wrench, and it's much easier with an impact. Anyway, so that kind of got him just to quit on the project, put what he had back together, and it was just roughly back together. Everything was still kind of loose. And he literally drove it from his house next door into my driveway, and I backed it in here on the lift. So, you know, it's easy to get discouraged if things aren't going smoothly, and they weren't. And then he was time pressed on top of that. So he chose just to let us do it. All right, so the new ones use an 18 millimeter socket to tighten them. And then one of the problems with the original that was kind of a pain in the butt was you had to put, let me just grab it. So on the original, you had to put a wrench, 8 millimeter wrench down here on this end, and then you could take, with a wrench, another wrench, you could take the 18 millimeter nut off. On the new one, this spacer that's back here has flats on it, so you can put a wrench on it. So now you can use a socket out here and a wrench over here, which is going to make it much nicer. So honestly, the aftermarket did a better job, and these are stiff enough they're going on without it. Do our steering arm. All right, so now we have to put the rotor on. As the rotor, we have to remember to put the O-ring on. What I found is if you just get a little bit of WD-40 on there, you're going to push in on the rotor pretty tight, and then the O-ring will go right on. You're going to push it on pretty tight, as far as you can, and then work that O-ring back into that groove. WD-40 seems to just make it go a little quicker and easier. You don't need very much, just a few drops. Only 1 millimeter. And then don't forget to put your sensor back together. And that's a 10 millimeter. For that bolt on the back of the upright. Again, doesn't need to be super tight, just snug it in there. Look everything over, make sure you tightened everything. Now, we need to torque this nut. If you have somebody here that can stand on the brakes, that will work. Otherwise, you're going to either need to put the tire on, and depending on your wheel, if you've got a through hole, then you can put the wheel on, set it on the ground, the wheel will act as your brake, and you can just put your socket and everything through it. If you don't have that, you could also try getting a long pry bar, putting it between a couple of the lugs, and something like that right there, and then tighten it down. So Just depends on what you have. That's how you're gonna have to do that. A lot of this would be helpful if you have a second person, you know, like where you're trying to push the strut up in there and then reach over the top to tighten the nuts. If you had a second person, they could put those on. Somebody else could stand on the brake right now, get the torque done. This would go pretty darn quick. So I'm gonna knock these two out, get the tire on, or knock this out, get the tire on, then we'll lower the truck down and tighten up the strut bolts on top. And then one more item the customer asked me to do, which is to put a light bar on the front of his car. So I've already taken the front bumper cover off, which you probably already noticed. And I had to go get hardware because, of course, you buy your mounting kit from one company and your light from a different company, and none of it matches up. So we'll get to that next. So what we've got is a light, and then you buy a bracket kit that's specific to this truck, and it goes up here. The problem that I found when I started looking at trying to install it is the light is hidden behind this bracket because it doesn't really drop it down far enough to get in there. And then they tell you if your truck came with tow hooks, that you're just going to take the tow hooks off, put these brackets on, put the tow hooks back on. Well, I think what really needs to happen is the tow hooks would have to be on there to lower this down far enough to clear. Well, this truck didn't come with tow hooks. It causes two problems. One, we don't have enough space. Two, there are no nuts inside the bumper here to actually send the bolts through and into, and they don't give you nuts for the bolts. They give you longer bolts to go through the tow hook and the new frame bracket, mounting bracket, but they don't give you any way to do it. So the other problem I found is that the bolts they tell you to use to go through the bracket and into the light are too long. They leave about a quarter or maybe 3/8 of an inch after they bottom out in the light. So I went down to the local hardware store and I picked up a bunch of hardware. And what I came up with is I'm going to use a threaded, I don't even know what they're called. It's threaded on both sides. One side's, they're both, you know, right-handed threads, but you can put a bolt in from both sides. And I can run a bolt in through the hole on the top. That gives me a spacer, and then I can run a bolt in from the bottom and should be able to make a nice looking mount that will get the light down far enough that it'll actually shine through the grill of the car. And I thought about just using like a piece of tubing, pipe or something, and trying to make that work with a long bolt. So the other thing I was going to try and do was put some riv nuts in the holes here, and then I could just use a bolt again and a spacer. The riv nut, the holes are so big that the 10mm bolts that everything is drilled out and made for, that riv nut is too small to actually capture in there. So you'd have to go to a 12mm, possibly a 14mm to fill the hole that's in the body. So I looked at a bunch of different options. This seemed to be probably the most economical, time-saving, and still make it easy enough to get all the parts together. So now the next thing is I'm going to go ahead and change out the 8mm bolts that go in the end of the lights for one that is shorter. That's pointed down just a little bit. Might try pointing it down just a hair more. And what we want is this centered on the car. And I'm just centering that RC. And I think we're there. So now we can tighten up all of our nuts. These were all 17mm. Alright, so the light bar is mounted good and sturdy. It's tight. We need to run some wiring. And to be honest, I'm not going to do the inside of the car wiring because I don't know where the owner wants the switch. But it does come with a complete light kit. So we'll get Everything but the last part of the pigtail mounted so that he can put his switch wherever he wants it. It looks like it just comes with double-sided tape to mount that switch. If it was mine, I'd find I'm sure there are spots in this truck, just like there are in almost every other truck, where you can have additional lights on the dash, or light switches on the dash, and I would go through and find one of those and tie the lights into that switch just so it looked factory. But it's not mine, and all I was asked to do was get the light hung, and he didn't even ask me to run the wires, but I'm gonna run them down through here before I put the bumper cover back on, because it'd be easier to be able to hook everything up and then secure the wires up out of the way, and then he can take it from there with it and run. So this is the stud that you can mount, or that you can ground for if you were doing like a jump start. Right over in this little area is a red box that we can get positive or get our positive 12 volts from. The leads are not very long, so we're gonna have to try and fish stuff through and mount this behind the stud here. Mount the relay. Right, I'm just gonna use a self-drilling screw here. I did grab stainless steel, which I just promptly dropped. And guess what? Because it's stainless steel, you also can't use a magnet to go get it. So we got that coiled up and shoved in the corner. I've got the wire that goes to it for the owner to set his switch wherever he wants it. And then we'll go ahead and raise the Jeep back up, hook up the last wire to the light, and put the bumper cover back on. Alright, so this thing banging against that would probably drive me nuts before very long. So what we're going to do is wrap that connector on a little bit of the foam that came with the light, that mounted the light. And then you have 7 of these twist lock keepers. 3 go across here, and then there's 2 in each fender well. I'd say get the one in the, there's one right up here in the corner that's the hardest to get to, so I'd say get that one first, and then the rest are pretty easy. And now the skid plate, and I didn't take this off, so it's going to take a minute to figure it out. So there's 2 that use a 13mm bolt head. They go at the back. There's 1 plastic keeper. It goes in the center at the back. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 10mm headed bolts. And they all go across, looks like the front, and then to tie the side panel and this other together. Don't forget to go back and torque all the wheels. If you've had them off, even using the impact, you really need to check them, make sure they're torqued. And then, it doesn't say it in the instructions, but my recommendation would be you go back after 100 miles of driving and put a torque wrench on every one of these bolts that we've just played with, which does mean you're going to pull all the wheels off again, or at least the front wheels. You might be able to get everything in the back without it, but that's just for safety, security, and peace of mind that you didn't miss any of the bolts and you got everything good and tight. So I'm going to make a phone call to my neighbor, let him know, well, not my neighbor anymore, I guess, but let him know it's ready, and we're going to pull this out of here. Well, that's it for this time on Allison Customs Project Car TV. 2015 Jeep is done, gone, and on its way. And I just have to clean up the mess. So please like and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, all that YouTube stuff. And we'll see you again next time on Allison Customs Project Car TV.